This is one of those days I just know I ought to move this thing back a couple inches, because by the time I'm done here, it might be off that step. I'm very aware of that, by the way. It's a regular thing. It's part of our Sunday routine. We have to move the pulpit back before Matthew knocks it off. So we've been doing this series on the Ten Commandments, looking at this oftentimes very familiar list of very sort of quick statements about how God's people ought to live. These sort of 10 baseline rules that I'm hoping by now you're beginning to realize, as simple as they might be stated, are actually very deep in how they apply to our lives. And today we're looking at the fourth commandment, to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And some people might be sitting there right now, well, here I am in church, so check. I got that one today. But as you no doubt are maybe anticipating, as we explore this subject of Sabbath, you're going to realize that this idea of rest is way deeper than what did I do on Sunday morning, and something that applies to our life in a lot of different ways. I want to, as a bit of a disclaimer, this was a bit of a hard one to start to prepare for, because a year ago I did a whole series on Sabbath, you may remember. And so what my brain wanted to do was take 8 weeks of sermons and jam them into one day, which doesn't work. So there might be a little bit of some pieces, little pieces here and there, that it's just hard to not include those. But if this is something especially that intrigues you, it's all on YouTube. I encourage you to go back. It was right at the start of the year. So if you go back to like January 2021, you'll find the start of the series and you can kind of follow through with it. And we talked a great deal about rest and what it means to be in God's presence and what it means to rely on God's presence in your life. But we're going to be looking at a story from Exodus chapter 16. But before we get to that, I want to just talk a little bit about sort of how it applies today. That's kind of been our routine these past couple of weeks, is to look at, this subject of rest and how does it apply today. One of the things that I regularly encounter when I talk, I talk with Christians in general, but especially with older Christians. If you've been a Christian 30 plus years, I find this quite often. We talk about how things have changed in church and what kind of things are different today than they were. And not just, of course, church, but also society. And one of the most common things people remember is they'll say, I remember when on Sundays you weren't allowed to, and they insert something. Who remembers having Sundays and prohibitations on Sunday? Things you weren't allowed to do, right? Sunday had a very strict regimen to it, right? There's this idea, and this is not a criticism of that at all. I'm not trying to poke fun at that, but because there was something to that, and I think we'll discover that in a second. But there was this idea that that was very long held, not just in the church, but also really in our society, that certain things you didn't do on Sunday. I remember growing up, I didn't even really grow up as a Christian. I didn't go to church growing up, but I remember my parents talking about how, I'd say, hey, let's go to this store. Can we go to this store? And they said, well, they might not be open. A lot of places aren't open on Sunday. Anyone remember when most stuff wasn't open on Sunday, right? Like, good luck getting gas. It was like 3/4 of the gas stations weren't open. And that was when I was a young child. I remember that being the case. But no doubt you've noticed that things have shifted pretty substantially. Nowadays, just about everything is open on Sunday. Although some places, they're closed, they close early, or they open a short period of time. Just about everything's open on Sunday. Just about everything, and it's gotten to the point where, quite frankly, Sunday in our society is more or less an ordinary day of the week. There was this idea in a culture, our culture, American culture, and church culture too, right? That taking time for rest mattered. And that is slowly but surely disappearing from our world in a lot of ways. It certainly applies to things like, no day of the week is now set apart, that we would have certain things we don't do on those days, right? That we would spend that time with our families and we shouldn't be out shopping for a dishwasher. And again, that's not a criticism if you've gone and done that, but there's this sense in which that's disappearing. And it's not just something like Sunday or the weekend, right? It's something deeper than that, because I remember I worked retail for many years, and Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. To be honest, when I started working in retail, it was kind of a fun thing. You got up at like early in the morning and there's this big line of people and it's kind of chaos, and it was kind of a fun thing. And then they opened earlier and earlier and earlier, and then slowly but surely all the stores were open on Thanksgiving too. And this idea of a holiday where you celebrate what you're thankful for and you rest and you spend time with your family was quickly encroached upon by sort of the economic demands of businesses. This idea that we don't need to close for a day of the week. We don't need to close. Like, we'll just make more money if we're open during that. And culture followed suit. And of course, it's way bigger than that too, because even in the day-to-day, the idea of creating and setting aside space for rest is sort of getting forgotten. We have these devices, right, that keep us connected all the time. And there's sort of an expectation that people will be able to get a hold of you at a moment's notice whenever they need to. Now, I've kind of touched on a lot of different examples, but I did that to give us kind of an array of looking at where this problem is starting to come from. And it's this idea that there's no space. There's no space. Our society doesn't promote space for God. It doesn't promote space for family, and it certainly doesn't promote space for rest. And actually, you're slowly but surely becoming increasingly criticized if you think you ought to have that. But we're going to discover pretty quickly is that rest isn't just a good idea, it's actually God's idea. We're going to look at this passage from Exodus chapter 16, verses 4 through 5, and then we're going to skip ahead to verse 17 through 30. The stuff in the middle there, you're of course to read at another point, that sort of details this issue of God providing. But a couple things about this. First off, this occurs sort of right after God delivers his people from slavery in Egypt. They have been captive, and they have had these cruel taskmasters, and they've been delivered, and now God is beginning to lead his people. And actually, strangely enough, sometimes people will say, well, what about before God gave the Ten Commandments? This is before God gave the Ten Commandments. This is about 4 chapters before God gave the Ten Commandments. So God's rules and his ordinances existed before he laid them out in a list of commands, right? And so we'll look at this. We'll look at the way this command sort of plays out and how Israel sort of freshly delivered from slavery plays this out, starting at verse 4 of chapter 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day, and in this way I will test them to see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Sort of fast forwarding to verse 17. So now he's given the command. This is them living that out. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little, and when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until the morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses, and they kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell, and so Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. And he said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. And so they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded. And it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You'll not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it. But on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, and they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the seventh day, and no one is to go out. And so the people rested on the seventh day. This is the word of the Lord. God delivers his people from slavery in Egypt, and he's done this through miracles, right? He's done these amazing miracles to get Egypt to let them go, although they did so begrudgingly, and then pursued them yet to try to recapture them. But God has done amazing things to provide for their deliverance from slavery. And now, in the midst of the desert, one of the things about being a slave is that you don't have any possessions. You don't have any stuff. And so these people are out in the wilderness, and if they don't find, the wilderness of Israel is a desert mostly, okay? They're not liable to find much to provide for themselves. They don't have the means to set up sort of farming, and if you did, you'd have to wait for it a very long time for your crops to come up. But God says, I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to supernaturally enable you to be sustained in the midst of this. And he does that through providing every day something called manna. He talks about bread from heaven. Sort of these little flakes or wafers, or sometimes people think about them as like chips that would appear on the ground every morning. And they would gather those up, and it would nourish them and sustain them. And he actually, in the section that we sort of skipped over there, he also provides quail on a nightly basis, right? Give them a little variety, which shows you how much God didn't just give them the minimum. He actually cared for their needs in an even greater way. But he gives this instruction that he's going to provide for them, but he also gives a couple instructions on how they live into that provision. And he tells them to do 2 things. He says, for one thing, every day gather only as much as you will need. Anything beyond what you need will go to waste. And so take what you need and trust that the next day I'm going to give you more. The next day I'm going to provide even more. And so he gives them this pattern. Take as much as you need for the day, but then he, at the end of this, says, on the 6th day, I want you to do something special. I'm going to provide enough for 2 days just so you don't have to do anything the next day. And as a matter of fact, I'm not going to provide in that next day, because the expectation is that I am giving you enough that you will be able to rest. You're not going to go hungry. And of course, the challenge here is that every single day, the expectation is going to be that it's going to rot and go bad, except for this one. And so Israel has to trust that on this day, uniquely, God is going to sustain more, that they will be able to rest. He's not just going to provide, he's going to provide in such a way that he creates space for them to rest. And so they start living this out, and many of them do it successfully, but of course the 2 stipulations he gives, some people, they don't trust him. Some people try to hide some of the food every day, right? Like, well, what if he doesn't provide tomorrow? What if he doesn't give me enough? I need to do something special to provide for myself, so I'm going to take half of what I got today, and I'm going to store it for later. And of course, they wake up and they find it full of maggots and stinking with mold, because God's provision was daily, and the trust that he wanted from them was daily, not every other day, not to hoard and then not trust God for weeks on end. And then they get to the end of the week, and he gives them the instructions, gather twice as much. I love that the elders come to Moses and they're like, hey, they're gathering more than they should. And he says, no, they're supposed to do that, because tomorrow there's not going to be anything, and God's going to do something special on the 6th day. He's going to do something special so that they're actually able to rest. They're actually able to take that time, just as God rested from creation on the 7th day. And yet, some people still go out. I find that fascinating, because if you think about it, they woke up, they probably looked and saw that their food wasn't rotting, and they went out anyways. Maybe they thought they could store up more for themselves. Maybe they thought that they could get more, they could get ahead, right? If we work extra hard today, then we won't have to worry about the next day. But God's design was that they would work 6 days, and on the 7th, they would rest. And when God gives the 10 Commandments, he gives it exactly like that. He commands them to observe a Sabbath, a day of rest, but it comes with it these days of work. There's a pattern that God knits in the very fabric of the world, and when you follow it, God's provision is always enough. You don't have to go outside of it. The 4th commandment, that you would keep the Sabbath and keep it holy, keep it set apart, is unique for a number of reasons. First off, the other 9 commandments are all things you shouldn't do in some way or another. You should not worship other gods. You should not worship idols. You should not disobey your parents. Kids, look at your parents. You should not commit murder or adultery or lie or many of these other things. But this is something that God commands you to do. It's God's idea. It's not an option. Rest is not an option. We are designed to find rest. We are designed to be in a cycle. And when you look at that commandment in Exodus 20, you'll see he says, 6 days you shall work, and then the 7th you shall rest. One of the things we forget about the commandment to rest is that with it is this idea that you'll be productive elsewhere. We were created to be fruitful and multiply, and that doesn't just mean have children. Being fruitful means contributing to this world, that there's something you're created and designed to work, but you're also created and designed to rest. If God takes rest from creation, then you, as you create and contribute to this world, are also designed to rest. Sometimes people say, well, I don't really need to take a day off. I have tons of energy. Look, do you really think that you can do it better than God does? God recognized the importance of setting aside time. In this world that is broken and busted, and we have all kinds of stresses and difficulties, he knew that if you did not regularly schedule time with him to recuperate, to spend time in fellowship with him, to spend time with our families, to spend time away from work, we would run down. And there are people here, I don't know who it is, but the Holy Spirit tells me that there are people here, you've been just running this thing dry forever. And you might even get at the point with your jobs or with your work or with whatever you're doing in your life that things feel really unproductive. And the reason they're unproductive is you haven't taken time to rest. Even the secular world is starting to discover this. They're doing all kinds of studies, and they're realizing that people who work 50, 60-hour work weeks are very often not as productive. They don't get as much done, despite how many hours, as people who spend less time but get proper rest. It's almost like God knew something about what he was commanding us to do. He recognized that to really be fruitful in this world and to really live with him, we needed regular time separated from work and in fellowship with him. Rest comes in a lot of different ways. I mean, on the most basic level, obviously it does include work. It includes, our jobs. If you're young people, your job is probably school. If you're not working, another thing. If you're a little kid, your job is play. There's even rest from play, isn't it? That's the work of a child, by the way, if you didn't know that. The work of a child is play. But they're still being productive. They're still being productive. They're still working. They're just working at the task that God has given them. And so taking time from work in the physical way, absolutely, that's important. It's important to your health. This body was given to you by God. We're supposed to take care of it. And part of taking care of it is taking proper and regular rest. But it's way deeper than that, too. Rest involves relinquishing the stress and the difficulty of this world to God. For many of us, we've been holding on to junk that has been holding us down and keeping us in this perpetual state of trying to work through things in our heart, when Jesus has been crying out to us through the Holy Spirit to let it go. He's got his hands on it, and we can trust him with it. Rest is about letting go of the toil and burden of this world. And it also includes this rest from the reality of sin. And I want to talk a little bit about that. That's really important. What I'm going to say is going to seem counterintuitive to you. But in truth is, it's so rooted in Scripture and so rooted in the pattern of how God actually deals with sin in our lives. There are some people who struggle with sin so perpetually, and the reason they do, there are lots of reasons, but one of the reasons they do is because they're working so hard in their own strength every single day to overcome it, but they can't, because they haven't taken the moment to actually dwell in the presence of God, where you will find the strength and the supernatural ability through the Holy Spirit to overcome it. In some sense, I'm saying that some people are not able to overcome those things because they're trying too hard in their flesh. And they need to take the rest with God and then begin again in their strength through the Spirit to overcome it. So many things in my life that God has transformed since I became a believer, it had to begin not with my own self-effort, but with surrender and spending time with the Lord. And when he began to minister to me, suddenly I was able to do things I never was able to overcome. We do not defeat sin primarily through working hard. Yes, we work, and yes, we struggle against sin, but we defeat sin primarily through resting in God and then operating out of the way he ministers to us every day. Some of you are sitting there and you're saying, I am so exhausted with this sin, and that makes sense. And the question I have is it because you've been doing it on your own? You watch the Olympics. Not the Winter Olympics that are going on right now, but you watch the Summer Olympics, you watch these pole vaulters. And the thing about pole vaulting is, yes, the person's an incredible athlete, but the reason they're able to hit these unbelievable heights that no human being could do on their own is because they rest and they put their energy into this pole, which leverages them to a degree they can never do. There's this real sense in which as Christians we are, yes, there's effort, but it's effort depending on something to enable us. And many of us have missed the dependency component. We've missed that idea that every 7 days you don't provide for yourself, you trust that he's already provided enough. I love this. When we looked at this passage, it said that some gathered much and some gathered little, but no one had too much and no one had too little. Everyone had exactly what they need. Maybe the trust issue is that what you have is enough, and you need to trust that it is. And then you'll be able to find that rest. Then you'll be able to take that break. Then you'll be able to spend the time with your family that you need to spend with your family as he's commanded us to do. I said throughout this series that the 10 Commandments weren't given to us to ruin our day. They were actually given to us to cause us to prosper. And so every single one of these things, if we grow in it, it's not just, okay, well, you're doing better at it, yay. It's like there's actual fruit to be born. And God knew when this world was broken, he knew when this world was a mess, when sin entered into the picture sort of right away, he knew that there would be toil and struggle, and so he prescribed rest that we would actually be able to live fruitfully in it. There's a sense in which it has to begin here before anything else. It is good to want to live well for Jesus. It is good to want to serve him. It is good to want to share the gospel with people. But until we grow in our ability to rest, or as much as we grow in our ability to rest in his presence and depend on him, we will struggle to do that fruitfully. Everything God calls you to do becomes more fruitful when you grow in the discipline of rest. So how do we do that? For one thing, set aside intentional time. Listen, the world is not going to give you space. It's just not. They're going to always, the world and the enemy are always going to tell you, you've got to do something else. You've got to fill your time every single second with something that's productive. And by the way, the enemy will say to you, well, that spiritual stuff, none of that is productive. Time in the Word, time in prayer, time at church, none of that is productive. He'll try to convince you of that. We have to recognize that being intentional about it is so important. That's why God prescribed a day. It's not about the legalism of the day. The Sabbath in the Old Testament was what day of the week? Anyone know right offhand? Saturday. But Christians began to observe it on Sunday because Sunday was the day that Jesus was risen. The principle of setting aside time was the thing that was important. It wasn't about the day. Sabbath isn't about the day. It's about a day, a period of time with Him. And it's not just one day of the week, okay, I've got that out of the way. It's about scheduling into your day periods of rest. That's why things like devotions are so important, because they're time to spend resting with God. It seems counterintuitive. A lot of people probably do their devotions first thing in the morning, which I commend. It's a great place to do it because A, you won't forget it, and it sets your day, the tone for the rest of your day. And it sounds counterintuitive, right? Like I'm going to wake up from sleep, and then I'm immediately going to spend time resting. But it's a different kind of rest, to rest with the Lord. And it prepares you for everything else that you have before you. So carve out time, be intentional, and then when you have the time, use it the way you're supposed to use it. Use it to spend time with God, and use it to spend time with your family. People say, well, that's not necessarily what you see in the Word as far as the family, but it really is, because the fact is, they're God's blessings to you, and your family is a huge part of how God works in your life. And so that time with your family is so important. Shut your phone off. That's me preaching to me, by the way. Shut your phone off. Put it in a drawer. Nothing. There's so many ways to communicate. If someone has a real emergency, they'll find a way to get a hold of you. I mean, really. Shut the phone off. I do, by the way, now. I've gotten to a point where I try to do that anyways. It's hard, and it's something I'm growing in, but I'm trying to get to the point where, like, I don't check my email on my day off. My day I'm supposed to take off is Wednesday. Again, I don't do it well all the time. I'm supposed to take Wednesdays off on fellowship night weeks. So, by the way, fellowship nights this week. You should come if you haven't come. Little plug there. I take Tuesday or Thursday, and I'm trying to get myself in a habit of, on those days, I don't check my email. If it's an emergency, the elders will get a hold. Elders know how to get a hold of me. I don't check my email. It can wait. And you'll be more productive. I remember spending time in seminary working on papers, and I'd sit there with a paper and struggle, and I'd hit this wall. And the issue was, I'd sit there for an hour and a half sitting in front of my desk, and I'd write like 4 sentences. And I hit this, people would call it writer's block or whatever, but the reality is I needed rest. And I would let go of that, and I would spend time with my wife, and I'd go out and walk my dog, and I'd come back, and I'd get more done in 2 hours than I did in the previous 2 hours, like way more. I'd get like 5 pages written in 2 hours as opposed to 4 sentences. It's because there was something God was calling me to actually take the break, and you will be more productive. Be intentional about how you use your time. Use it on things that will actually rejuvenate you. People say, I take rest all the time. Listen, sitting in front of the TV isn't really rest. It might be enjoyable. It might be fun, and I'm not even saying there's anything wrong with it. Go watch the Super Bowl tonight, okay? It's fine. But that's not rest. That's not the kind of rest God is prescribing. Recognize, guys, I want to say one last thing before I let you go today. One of the things that's important about this principle of rest and this command to rely on God is the reliance on Him for everything, including your salvation. And it's very easy, without us realizing it, to fall into the trap of performance-based Christianity. How do you know you've fallen into that? You know you've fallen into that when you start thinking about your relationship with God in terms of how well you have done. And you start thinking about how he's pleased with you, or if he loves you, or if he cares for you, in primarily rooted in how today went. How well did I obey his commands today? How well did I serve him today? And certainly we want to serve him well and grow in that. But did you know that God, think about the worst day you've ever had in regards to sin. Just take a second. If it's hard to think of this week. Worst day you had this week. Did you know that God loves you as much on that day as he did on the day that you got everything right or nearly everything right, and it was the most holy day you've ever had? His love never changes, ever. Let go of trying to please God. Rest in him, and then you'll actually be able to do it. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but if we're not careful, the constant attempt to please God turns into performance-based Christianity, and you're no longer depending on his grace to provide for you and actually enable you to do it well for him. Let's go to God in a word of prayer.